Today we're going to look at a method for creating something like this using Maya, combining Mesh and Bifrost. So this is just a Metaball type of animation where we want different objects to merge together. And there's no easy way to do this in Maya unless you're using particles and meshing those particles. But this method is actually much easier. So if we look in Maya, we've got that same object here. It's playing very slowly, but you can see that it's updating the mesh as it moves around. And the two stages for creating something like this is really to simply create a mesh network, if I can show this here. And in this case, it's just 4 spheres that are moving around. Taking that output repro mesh and putting it into a Bifrost network that first converts it to a volume, then converts the volume back to a mesh, and then outputs a piece of geometry. So let's just recreate that here. Maya's crashed on me a few times, so I'm hopeful that this will work. So I'll just create a cube and smooth it a couple of times. You could just use a sphere or any shape, doesn't matter really. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Just delete its history and freeze its transformations. And now we will create a mesh network. And we want to make sure we're creating a mesh type mesh network rather than an instancer. And we'll just create that. And so by default, it creates a linear distribution. And we'll switch that to spherical. Reduce the radius. And just to keep it a bit lighter, I'll just make 4 points. Now you can do whatever you want to this mesh network. You can add random size and so on, but we'll just keep it simple. But we do want these things to move, so we'll add a signal node. That's where it crashed last time, so for the best. Okay, that's working well. So the signal node is an animated random noise. And by default, it acts on position in 1 in X, 1 in Z, and 5 in Y. So I'm just going to switch them all to 1. They're just moving around a little bit. Of course, we can always go back and change this. I'm going to slow down or reduce the noise and slow down the animation with the noise scale and time scale in the signal node. Too much, too slow, I mean. I'm going to slow down just a little bit because it's playing back quite quickly. It's playing at 24 frames per second. Okay, so something like this. And like I said, we can always go back and change it. So now we're done with the mesh portion. And we'll just, in the Bifrost editor, we'll create a new graph. And we will bring in this repro mesh. So if we just middle mouse drag this in here, and now we just have to convert this to a volume and then back to a mesh and make an output mesh. So there are different ways of doing this, and I'll show you just one. I talk about different ways in my nerve growth tutorial. So here in the Bifrost graph, just hit tab and we'll search to convert to volume. Nope, that is not what we're doing actually. That is the other method. We're going to search for level, trouble typing, mesh to level set, and this is turning a mesh into a volume essentially, and then we want to convert that volume back to a mesh. So just search for volume to mesh, just hitting tab to get that menu. And so from the repro mesh, we just take the mesh out to the mesh in of the mesh to level set, and then the level set out to the volume in on the volume to mesh, and then the mesh out to the output node here. And there it's created. I'm just going to hide the repro mesh. So it's a little easier to see. This is the new mesh that has been created, and you can see that it's merging it together. So there are a few settings that we can change, and I'll admit from the outset to not understanding everything I'm seeing here. This is mainly experimentation on my part without truly understanding what all the attributes mean. But in the mesh to level set, the detail size, if we increase this, then we get a more roughly approximate representation of the underlying shapes, because the edges are only allowed to be a certain size. If you make it smaller, you get far more edges and you can match the shape more closely, but this is more of what I want. There's also this thickening value in the mesh to level set, so you can kind of grow this out a little bit if you want it to be a little bulgier. The volume mode is set to solid. You can experiment to shell to see if it makes any kind of difference. And I'm sure there are other things we could change here. The volume to mesh, this level threshold does something similar to the things we saw before. I'm sure this has something to do with the overlap of objects and when a new mesh is formed. But again, I don't quite understand. Property threshold does not seem to do anything. And then we can up the smoothing here. And you can see we get more relaxed triangles. So something like this. And again, there's a lot more to investigate here. But you can see the playback here is pretty good. Just around 8 frames per second. But we could play blast this out and see. So we're almost there. Save my scene. We now have to convert this into an actual piece of geometry in Maya. Right now you can see that this is a Bifrost graph shape or object. We want to turn this into a shape node. So if we open the node editor, it's not difficult to do, it's just not very obvious. Let me just clean this and I'll start again. We want to bring in that Bifrost graph object, so we'll just middle mesh drag it in. And then we want to create a node called Bifrost Geo to Maya, so it does what it says. And then we have to plug this into an empty shape node. So the easiest way to do this is just to create something like a polygon sphere. Delete the construction node. So we're just left with the shape node here. And we're going to plug these things together. Now, it doesn't always work for me the first time, so let's give it a shot. Yep, so from Bifrost graph shape meshes to Bifrost Geo, I believe. And then from this one, Maya mesh down to, okay, it's not working. This should be in mesh. So we have to take the first in the array here and go to in mesh. And then there is our new piece of geometry. So we can hide the Bifrost graph object now. Now we have an actual piece of geometry here. And it looks pretty good. And if we play the animation, let's save the scene. This feels like we're in crash territory. And there we go. So now we can just assign a material to something like this and open the Arnold render view and render this. Once my computer decides it wants to render. All right, so you can get a nice smooth fall off over something like this, and we still have control over everything, right? So if we go back, we can just close this node editor now, but if we go back into the Bifrost node, we can still change things like the detail size. If I change this to 0.3, right? So now it updates downstream to the polysphere. But we could even go back to the original MASH network. This makes me think it might crash if I do this, but I'm going to try it anyway. So if I change the number of points from 4 to 6, right? So now it's updated. and we have a different object. And what if we increase the radius? Then we can get something else kind of interesting here, where they get close together and sort of bridge over. You get some weird stuff going on here, so if you were doing something like that, you might want to, adjust the thickening value. And you get something like this. Now, just for the sake of interest, let's say we wanted to add an outside model into something like this. Let's say we wanted to have a little one of these things budding off and we wanted more control. The way that we can do this is to introduce another object into our Bifrost graph. So I'll just make a sphere. Save my scene. And I'll call this, vacuole. Make it a little bit smaller and maybe just move it over here. So I want to have this thing bud off and move away. So we're going to add this to our Bifrost graph. And we'll do just the same thing. So let's just middle mouse drag it in here. And then we want to duplicate these two things. Oops, sorry, I duplicated the wrong thing. Okay, that was wrong. Okay, so I just copied and pasted these. So the mesh to level set and volume to mesh. And then I just want to connect in the vacuole shape into here. Now I can't connect both of these volume to mesh nodes into the output. So we have to introduce another node. So merge volumes. I think, is it merge volumes? So, okay, I'm going to have to think about this. So we either want to merge it at the volume level here, and then put them into a single one of these, or merge the meshes. I'm not sure. So let's try. So let's take the level set to go into the merge volumes, and then the level set here. So there's another volume going in, and then the out volume we'll put into the volume to mesh. And we'll wonder if it worked. Yes, sorry, I had a bad extra connection in there. So it did work. So now that we've done that, we've got the original vacuole shape node here. I've hidden it, but we can still animate it moving. So it could be in here, and we could set some keys on translate, let's say. And then over time, we can have it move out and set another key. So we can just let this play. So that other mesh that we just created is in the middle of this thing, and now we'll get to the point where it starts to move out eventually. Not sure why I started it so late in the timeline. And there it goes finally. And then it kind of pinches off. So, you don't have to mix this with a mesh. You could have a big sphere here and a small sphere if you wanted to make it look like a vacuole is pinching off a Golgi body or something like that. Anyway, so there are lots of different things you can do with that. And now we just have this piece of geometry. And the final thing you could do, if you wanted to, is you could turn this into a limbic cache. So you could just export to Alembic, and then it would be a separate piece of geometry in its own file that's not connected to Bifrost in any way or to the mesh network. It would just preserve this animation, and you could bring it back into your scene. Let's say you wanted multiple cells dividing, you could bring that Alembic back in. Anyway, I don't want to go any longer, so I hope you found this helpful, and give it a try and let me know how it goes.